symbol from the lost civilization of ancient Egypt, the mummy. In the beginning, the mummy was made naturally when the dead were buried away from fertile soil. The combination of Egypt's hot sun and desert sand against the skin caused the human form to remain intact. These forms became the foundation upon which a mysterious belief system was built. The mummy was a glimmer of light on the dark road of death. It signified hope. Hope that if the physical body could be preserved, perhaps the spiritual part of the person could as well. The mummy was the human metaphor for the Egyptians' most prominent god. Like the sun that rises and sets, the dead would once again be reborn. For the ancients, the mummy was the central object needed to achieve immortality. In death, the person would split into many formless parts that would reunite once again in the carefully preserved outline. Everyone wanted to be mummified, so the ancients developed a man-made process to artificially produce the same effects as the environment. Mummification became big business. The ancients had successfully discovered the secret to mummification. It was dehydration. They then took that knowledge and created an elaborate procedure that could take as long as 70 days. It was during that time that many of the organs were discarded, including the brain, which was scraped out through the nose with a long hooked tool, piece by piece. After the internal organs were removed, the body was left to dry in natron, a salt-like substance found in Egypt. 35 days later, the embalmers returned to finish their work, but not alone. Priests clad in strange costumes whispered spells to ensure the deceased's safe passage to a world beyond. Crawling down, breathing may take place in the head of the deceased, the underworld, that he may see with his eyes. At the end of the ritual, the body was laid to rest in yet another enduring symbol from this ancient land, the tomb. It was known as the eternal house to the Egyptians. The tomb was designed to protect the mummy forever. As the story of the ancients unfolded, tomb construction like mummification evolved. The tomb played the part of the mythological mound from which all creation sprang. Tombs went from simple sand pits to flat-surfaced structures known as mastabas. Then in 2600 BC, the mastaba gave way to an architectural enhancement. By stacking these bench-like objects, the first pyramid rose, the step pyramid of Saqqara. Over a period of 2 centuries, the pyramid continued to develop. Then in 2400 BC, the ancients' many grand ideas culminated in the construction of the sole survivors of the 7 wonders of the world, the pyramids of Giza. They were the monumental casings of 3 generations of royal mummies. Their sturdy construction was designed to enable the almighty pharaoh to reach the other side. From there, he would bestow blessings back to his loyal subjects, allowing the beloved Egyptian lifestyle to continue. It was a necessary journey, and insurances were built both directly inside and out of the pyramids. The plateau that plays host to these gigantic granite triangles has a guardian, the Great Sphinx, the ever-watchful limestone sentinel. This massive mixture of man and beast was carved in the image of Khafra, the king whose complex it silently protects. The Great Sphinx was thought to stand as a representation of the dead king, a king that could still receive offerings over a period of thousands of years. For the Egyptians, statues like the Sphinx were often as sacred as the mummy. Many were found in tombs, but unlike the mummy, they were visible. They stood as the proxies for the preserved outline as a safeguard against damage or destruction. The Great Sphinx, the Pyramids of Giza, and the mummies are the age-old mysterious treasures that have become synonymous with the people from Egypt's past. These determined people had waged a war against their own mortality. It was a fight that would last as long as their civilization. One they eventually lost, but not before leaving behind a detailed record of their beliefs.
Souls who are devoid of wrong, who exist for all eternity. Open to me, for I am a spirit in my own shape, and I have power by this, my magic. Save me from my aggressors.
They are the whispers of the ancients. They are the echoes of the past.
I have collected this magic in every place where it was, from the possession of anyone who possessed it.
They are the ancients' magical spells. They are the necessary words they believed they would need to achieve immortality.
Hail to you, great God, Lord of justice. I have come to you, my Lord. I have not done falsehood against men. I have done no evil. I have not killed. I am pure, 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 pure.
They are the translations of the ancient Egyptians' inscriptions. They are the hieroglyphs.
Hieroglyph is a Greek word, sacred carving. When the Greeks came in, it was mainly the priests who were the literate class, and they looked at these things and said, oh, these are the priestly writings, the sacred writings.
The Greeks were not far from the truth. For the ancient Egyptians, the hieroglyphs were in fact sacred. Whether colorfully painted or deeply carved, they were written to convey important information.
It's literally the words of the gods. The Medjit Necher is what it was called in ancient Egypt. Not only was it thought to be essentially a gift to the gods, but hieroglyphs had a very potent ability to transcend life and death.
You can then communicate between this world and the next world. You can deal with your dead ancestors. You can deal with the gods through this medium, which is a means by which you can get back and forth and by which you can help to control those forces which are otherwise in a world over which you have very little control.
Despite the ancients' strong belief in their potent power, as the culture became blurred by invaders, the Egyptians' voices were muted by new ways of worship. In the 4th century AD, the last hieroglyph was carved here at the Temple of Philae. And once all Egyptian priests had died, the ability to read the sacred inscriptions died as well. For almost 1,500 years, the voices from long ago remained silent. For centuries, educated thinkers tried to decipher these strangely shaped symbols, but to no avail. Often what these perplexed scholars lacked in knowledge, they made up for with imagination. 17th century, it was suggested that the hieroglyphs contained the mysteries of the universe. Then in the 18th century, there was a breakthrough when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. In 1798, Napoleon came to the ancient land with an army of soldiers and Egyptian scholars. The soldiers were brought to fight the enemy, while scholars were brought to measure the monuments, study the architecture, and copy the inscriptions. Their efforts were designed to better understand the lost civilization. Interestingly, the most important discovery came not from a scholar. Instead, it was a soldier who was responsible for unearthing the tremendous artifact that broke open the walls barring an understanding of the past. In the summer of 1799, the French were losing to the British, who had also invaded Egypt. In an effort to strengthen defenses, the French were rebuilding an Arabic fort along the Nile near the town of Rosetta. While tearing apart the fortress walls, a soldier tripped upon an almost 1,500-pound tablet. This tablet would become known as the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was the first discovery of its kind. It contained the 3 types of script familiar to the people from the lost civilization. There were the sacred carvings or the hieroglyphs, another form of ancient writing known as demotic, and a script in a language still understood by the modern world, Greek. However, despite the familiar words upon the Rosetta Stone, its missing pieces made it difficult to decipher. For over 2 decades, scholars tried to grasp the meaning behind the mysterious script. After hours of intellectual labor, a 32-year-old bookseller's son, with an affinity for language, known as Jean-François Champollion, cracked the secret code and deciphered the stone. Its content contained a thank you note from priests to Pharaoh Ptolemy V, written in 196 BC. Champollion had proved that the hieroglyphs were more than mere picture writing. They were in fact symbolic of both sounds and concepts. His work was the necessary weapon needed to break the silence, and the voices of the ancients could once again be heard while reading the hieroglyphs.
The common soul journeys on to whence it came, nor can it ever stray to pass yesteryear.
Now listen to me. Pay attention to what people say. Spend your days happily. Forget your troubles.
Preserve and hold in trust this letter. Someday it might bring you good. The bodily form, the stars, planets. Their magic is working within him.
Just look at us. We are successfully returned. This is our country. We are home.
There was far less guesswork. Assumptions were thrown away now. We could read things. We could fix who were the kings. We could read all the kings' names, so we know who came in order, who came after Ramses, who came before Tutankhamun, and we could fix who went where. Before, it was going from just bits and pieces and guesses of what the Greeks had left us. So Egyptology advanced tremendously after the hieroglyphs were deciphered.
Egyptology had a new understanding of the people, as well as a better understanding for the purpose of these ancient inscriptions.
They were a system of writing, and they manifest themselves in recognizable forms of objects, animals, men, beasts, flowers, items out of nature, physical things like mountains, the sun, the moon. The whole range of human experience, in a sense, is encapsulated in the forms of these hieroglyphs.
It tells you what was important to them. It tells you what they thought the world was like, what they thought happened to them after death, their place in the universe. It tells you their fears and their hopes. It basically puts you in touch with the ancient Egyptians as living people.
And once the ancient Egyptians spoke to modern man, they often had interesting and mysterious tales to tell. The hieroglyphs are one of the ancients' greatest inventions. They spent time recording everything from fears, hopes, and dreams to major events within the civilization. This beautifully written script has given experts insight into the minds behind the well-preserved Egyptian faces. It seems scholars have mastered the translations, but they do agree the hieroglyphs still present a problem. Though their meaning may be clear, their proper pronunciation remains a mystery. The hieroglyphs contain no vowels.
Probably one of the worst systems ever invented for writing a language because of the things it doesn't show. But at the same time, hieroglyphs have a functionality and a beauty that you don't find in, let's say, alphabetic scripts. Alphabetic scripts are almost always written in one direction. Hieroglyphs you can write right to left or left to right, horizontally or vertically, so that it makes a nice visual statement as well as a statement of whatever the hieroglyphs say.
The hieroglyphs are similar to the ancients' art and architecture. When something was significant, they would create on a grand scale to emphasize the meaning, and the hieroglyphs were no exception. They were used for formality. They were written on important buildings, grand monuments, and idealized statues, yet they were the most difficult to understand in the Egyptian system of writing. So when a child learned to write, he would begin with the more cursive script known as hieratic. The hieratic developed around the same time as the hieroglyphs back in 3100 BC. They were to them what handwriting is to printing. It was a simpler type of script, used to record everyday matters like legal affairs, letters, and contracts. Despite this simpler form, experts believe 90 to 99% of the entire population could not read, including the men responsible for the artful imagery of the hieroglyphs, the scribes.
I think that a lot of the people of Egypt who were even literate in terms of hieratic would not be able to get all the subtleties and read all the text in hieroglyphs. Because hieroglyphs are used to write a language which is a dead spoken language. It's as though the French of the Middle Ages are learning in the school to write Latin. They're speaking vulgar Latin, but they're writing classical Latin. So for most of the time that hieroglyphs were being written, the people who are writing it are not speaking a language which is reflected by those hieroglyphs.
Being unable to read the script often presented a problem for the scribe, causing him to make mistakes. Even today, on many of the walls where hieroglyphs were written, there is evidence of the mistakes made so long ago.
It's not an automatic thing because it's not one sign for one sign. There's a whole writing system in hieratic and a whole writing system in hieroglyphic, and you can't just do it one for one.
Creating the hieroglyphs was a laborious process. The text was written in hieratic by one man, then converted from hieratic to hieroglyphic by another, only to be corrected by a third. Then came the sculptor, the man responsible for following the outlines of the scribe. Then another scribe with the ability to read checked for mistakes by the sculptor. Then came the final phase, where the painter gave the hieroglyphs color. The inability to read the sacred script did not diminish the belief in its power. For the ancients, hieroglyphs even played a part in their religion. Thoth was the god of writing, and he is shown in relief as the ibis-headed human that often carries a palette in hand. For the ancient Egyptians, the hieroglyphs were magical. Like their mummies, tombs, and statues, they too were an important element for achieving immortality.
There were magical spells placed on the mummies on the bandages. There were magical spells placed on the walls of pyramids. There were magical spells placed on coffins. And the principle of the magical spells of these hieroglyphs was that the word is the deed. So, for example, if I write on my coffin that the king is going to grant me thousands of loaves of bread, thousands of jars of beer, then it's true. It happens.
The Egyptians actually believed that the hieroglyphs found within the spells could magically come to life. This presented a problem. The ancients were concerned that the birds would fly away or the creatures would crawl off the coffins, which could ruin the spells. Therefore, they occasionally wrote the hieroglyphs in an incomplete form.
Take, for example, a picture of a horned viper, kind of a snake with little horns on its head. It's the most dangerous snake in Egypt. They say, as a matter of fact, if you get bit by a horned viper, there's only one thing to do: have a cigarette. Anyway, it was a hieroglyph representing the sound F. Yet, it was at the same time a picture of a real living being, a dangerous serpent. And so, sometimes, in certain periods of Egyptian history, they would render this hieroglyph harmless by cutting it in half, so that it would not somehow be able to magically work its dangerous harm on an individual.
The words written in the hieroglyphs were designed to help the mummy as well as preserve the memory of the dead.
Man dies, his body is dust, but writing shall make him remembered, alive in the mouths of any who read. Egyptian Papyrus, 1300 BC.
A way that the ancient Egyptians perpetuated themselves was to make sure that their name is found in some place, and hopefully repeatedly, so that even if by accident it gets damaged, or if by deliberate malice my enemy comes along after my death and hacks out my name, hopefully someplace, maybe hidden underneath something, is still my name, that I will continue to exist. So all writing has at least a potential for magical implications.
Somehow, that name, that combination of sounds, whether I speak it or whether I write it down on a piece of paper and give it to you, evokes an image in your mind. That image is somehow like the person whose name that is. Therefore, the name somehow has something of the individual in it.
For the ancients, the hieroglyphs were as necessary as any other preparation for death, and one with a long history. Here, in the area most famous for playing host to the first true pyramid, the Pyramid of Saqqara, there are many tombs. Below their crumbled exteriors, some of the earliest texts still survive. These hieroglyphs are from the period known as the Old Kingdom, which dates back to 2600 BC.
In the Old Kingdom you have what's called the pyramid texts, and those are reserved just for the king. And those contain all of these spells, probably from very, very ancient original sources, but these are texts meant just for the king and to guide him in the next world, in the afterlife, what he needs to say, where he needs to go, what he needs to do.
The king, this is he. Lord of the twisty ways of wisdom, his magnificence lights the black sky, his power flames in the land of the risen. The time of the king is now, it is eternity, his boundaries they touch infinity. Through this his power to do what he will, avoid whatever he hates, concerning all things in the kingdom of heaven, throughout all space and time.
In 2000 BC, during the period known as the Middle Kingdom, there was a change in the hieroglyphs. The spells that once covered only the tomb walls of pharaohs began appearing on the wooden coffins of those with the ability to afford the expense.
So in a sense, you can see a sequence of personalization here, from the walls of the pyramid on a large scale to the walls of the coffin on a much more human scale, to finally something that you can take along with you, a scroll of papyrus.
This scroll of papyrus dates back to 1500 BC and is perhaps best known as the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead, like the pyramid texts and coffin texts, was created to enable the deceased to safely pass through the dangers of the next world, and this important text was often costly.
A person, particularly, let's say, a middle-class, upper-middle-class person, might spend quite a bit of money preparing for his afterlife. This is an interesting phenomenon. We know, for instance, that a roll of papyrus cost about a portion of a month's salary of a workman. Not a tremendous amount of blank papyrus, but if it was decorated with texts and scenes of the Book of the Dead, this could cost, half a year's salary.
If you really believe that you're going to live forever, then you're not going to put all your money into your daily life on this earth. It's the next one that really counts. So they put their finances, their efforts into the next world rather than this one, because that was going to be a lot longer.
The Book of the Dead outlined and defined in great detail the ancients' ideas of the mysterious world beyond. The Book of the Dead is a collection of almost 200 magical spells. The earliest copy dates back to the middle of the 15th century BC, but according to experts, the spell it contains can be traced back to over 1,000 years before that. For the ancients, it was like a written form of ammunition designed to both arm and enlighten. On the day of burial, the Book of the Dead was buried too. It was there to protect the mummy within the tomb, prepare the mummy for the final journey, and ensure the mummy every necessity in the next world.
I mean, they're there to be read by the dead. Certainly the dead person would have been, you could have seen him sitting up in his tomb, in his burial, and unrolling his Book of the Dead. I mean, no one else was going to read that Book of the Dead.
The Book of the Dead held valuable information. Found within the text were the secrets of the terrifying trip to the other side. For the ancients, immortality was the ultimate goal, but for them, getting there was not going to be easy.
Think of it in terms of sleep. When you go to sleep, you can have bad dreams. You can have nightmares. And in a way, the ancient Egyptians imagined that the sun's journey through the next world, through the underworld during the night, and the dead person's journey parallel to that of the sun, was the worst of all possible nightmares.
I once explained somewhat flippantly, but to some extent it's true, that the ancient Egyptian idea of death was like a dark flume ride, where things are coming out from the sides and confronting you where your boat is in fact the serpent of life. And this whole flume ride, this dark journey through the underworld, was simply a reflection of the journey through Egypt itself, where you go through the different gates of the different nomes and the different districts. You see, to go from south to north, from, say, Aswan to the Mediterranean. So it was a kind of as above, so below kind of reflection.
With the Book of the Dead, the ancients tried to magically master their fears. Death was less frightening once defined, so they continued to develop ways to shed light on the dark side. It was part of the evolution of pyramid texts and coffin texts. In the Middle Kingdom, when spells were written upon coffins, they were accompanied by illustrations. These illustrations were essentially the maps that helped guide the individual through the strange journey encountered after death. When the New Kingdom emerged, the text and the maps split in two. The text became known as the Book of the Dead, while the maps became the Netherworld Guides. Both could be found within the tomb, and each had written material, yet they differed. The Netherworld Guides had more illustrations and splintered into several books. They have names like Amduat, the Book of Caverns, and the Book of Gates.
There are 12 gates in the Netherworld, one for each hour. Each gate is guarded by a serpent who asks you questions, and you have to be able to answer the questions correctly in order to pass that gate and proceed to the next one.
By pre-planning, the ancient Egyptians continually tried to answer the questions surrounding the unknown. It seemed they wanted no surprises when it came to this imaginative adventure, and according to their descriptions, it was going to be a tough trip. Within this strange realm, there were things like men with flames bursting from their heads, drowned forms floating in water, and decapitated bodies. The ancients were vivid in their imagery, but when it came to the question of death, they were really no different from any other culture. It was merely their beliefs that set them apart. The ancient Egyptians had many theologies concerning life after death. Often they were contradictory, but always complementary. It gave the religion depth, and unlike the religious beliefs in other cultures, it provided them with choices. The ancient Egyptians could select the theology that best suited them, and they had the option of choosing more than one.
We think they actually had samples of different compositions which they would show the owner of the tomb and say, do you want this scene, or do you want this scene, or do you want this scene? And they'd select a scene, and we think when they're doing the tomb paintings, they actually had little copybooks. And certainly we can tell from the way they executed the drawings that we have somebody going in first with red and doing a very quick sketch, and then it's corrected by a master artisan in black. So you have a team doing those drawings. It's not one person.
Yet despite all the options and efforts for achieving immortality, there was still one part of the journey that was left entirely to the individual. This was the belief that dates back to around 2000 BC, and it was by far the most important. The ancients' lives were leading to this moment, to this final step, to this place known as the Judgment Hall. Here the Egyptians were questioned and held accountable for their earthly actions.
The particular quiz is a bit like doing a driving test in America, where you're asked a whole series of questions on the quiz, and if you don't get them today, you can come back tomorrow and get them right because you know what the questions are. You've been able to look up the answers.
In the Judgment Hall, the deceased answered those questions. He denied committing wrongful acts by reciting magical words from the Book of the Dead to a tribunal of 42 gods. This spell was known as the Negative Confession or the declaration of innocence.
I know the name of the 42 gods of those who are with you in this hall of justice, who live on those that cherish evil, and who gulp down their blood on that day of the reckoning. Behold, I have come to you. I have brought you truth. I have repelled falsehood for you. I have not done falsehood against men. I have not impoverished my associates. I have done no wrong in the place of truth. I have done no evil. I have not done what the gods detest. I have not caused pain. I have not killed.
While the dead recited the spell, his heart, which the ancients considered the seat of intelligence, was weighed against a feather, which was symbolic of the ancients' concept of the way things should be. It was here a person's worldly actions were judged. Again, the deceased would recite a predetermined spell, but this time the words were not directed to the tribunal of gods.
O my heart, which I had from my mother, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. For you are my ka, which was in my body. Do not make my name stink to the entourage who make men. Do not tell lies about me in the presence of the god.
If the heart and the feather were shown equal in weight, the person was vindicated. Then, the deceased was formally transferred by Horus, the god of living, to Osiris, the king of the dead. In ancient Egyptian reliefs, the beams are shown balanced, but there was always a chance, a fear, and a consequence that might not have been the case.
The classic representation of what happens is that you are devoured by a demon who is a mythological creature who sits beside the scales and for hundreds and thousands of years is waiting for a meal because everyone who has the right texts and the right spells and so forth is vindicated. It's a little creature which is a combination of lion, hippo, and crocodile. It's called the Eater, and presumably when you're eaten, then you're extinct and you're gone.
The idea of extinction was the Egyptians' greatest fear, and through this belief, they successfully maintained order within their civilization for thousands of years. The ancients were bound by both earthly rules and by those of the unknown. Achieving immortality was not easy, but for the ancients, the magical world beyond was worth every effort. As the long history of the ancient Egyptian civilization unfolded, the beliefs in a life beyond death evolved as well. For approximately 3,500 years, the hieroglyphs were used to record the development of these ideas. According to the experts, the information from both the Old and Middle Kingdom is somewhat vague, but once the New Kingdom emerged around 1500 BC, the information becomes completely clear. For the ancients, there was a final destination following a mysterious journey. It was a better version of the world they knew. It was an idealized Egypt, and it was known as the Afterworld. The belief in a life after death was one that seemed to be shared by all, from the poorest peasant to the almighty pharaoh. In the end, according to their religion, regardless of their social standing, everyone would be equal. Everyone would associate with Osiris, the king of the dead, and everyone would enjoy a wonderful existence in the afterworld.
It's difficult to say exactly what they thought the next world was going to be like, but judging from the way it's depicted on the walls of the tomb. You see Egyptians having a great banquet, enjoying themselves, playing games, having musicians, entertaining them, all the things that we like to think of as having a good time, which kind of indicate to us that they thought the next world was going to be like that too.
There are scenes showing an idealized state where you go hunting in the marshes and there's a great abundance of wildfowl of all kinds. You can bring this down just with a simple throw stick. You have your cat hunting for you in the marshes as well. And altogether, a scene which is really improving on the experience of the individual in life.
In this belief of the afterworld, the ancients created a sense of hope where normally there would be none. It was the best of their lifestyle that gave fuel to their imaginations. The result was this land of plenty, this land of ease, and most importantly, this land of continued existence. The Book of the Dead provided the spells they thought would allow them admittance into this perfect place. Here begins the spells of the field of offerings, and the spells of going forth into the day, of coming and going in the realm of the dead, of being provided for in the field of rushes, which is in the field of offerings, having strength thereby, having power thereby, plowing therein, reaping and eating therein, drinking therein, and doing everything that used to be done on earth. In addition to spells, as an appeal to their gods, they brightly painted scenes of the desired life they would live upon their tomb walls.
There are images of the dead people working in the fields, but they're not sweating, they're not dirty, they're not dressed in rags, they're dressed in their finest garments, they're having a good time, they're harvesting grain or flax that's at least twice as tall as it would ever be in the world that we know.
The ancients thought Egypt was the best of all civilizations, and they did not want to leave it behind. Therefore, the emphasis placed on preparation for death was an acceptable part of their lives, but it has led many to misunderstand the meaning behind all their efforts. Even today, it is a common misconception that the Egyptians were preoccupied with death. They were not. In fact, it was an aching for life that drove them to such great lengths. Upon the tomb walls, alongside the colorful paintings of the afterworld, often there is other imagery, clearly depicting the heart-wrenching grief caused by death.
As to mourning and funerals, when a nobleman dies, all the women of the house put mud on their heads and faces. Then, leaving the body inside, they walk around the town and beat their breasts. The men also, for their part, do the same thing. Herodotus, Greek historian, 450 BC.
For the ancient Egyptians, there was the sadness of death to overcome, and the fear of it as well. Despite their detailed descriptions of the world beyond, this was uncharted territory, so in preparation they packed everything.
What they're doing is trying to prepare for every possible contingency they can think of. Just think of it, for example, you're packing to go to a country that you've never been to before. You're going to take along everything that you can imagine you can possibly need. The ancient Egyptians were thinking in the same terms when they were preparing for life after death. They didn't know what the country was going to be like. So, in a sense, they packed everything that they might possibly need.
In many tombs, you find a whole range of models showing the kind of things which an Egyptian nobleman would desire to have in the next life. And this would include granaries and boats, servants performing all kinds of activities for the benefit of their master. And we can imagine, I think, that these things could be available in the afterlife through the magical function of models, even if the owner hadn't possessed those things in life on Earth.
The 3D miniatures, the spells written in hieroglyphs, the netherworld guides, and the tomb paintings are all an indication of the importance the ancients placed on readying themselves for life after death. But their efforts did not end there. Throughout the ages, the tombs of the Egyptian elite have played the part of the world's greatest treasure chests, and they have been pirated by plunderers aware of the value of the goods inside. Yet despite the stealing, many of the objects still survive, including those found during what was probably the most fascinating discovery of the early 20th century, when the tomb of Tutankhamun